The tour bus was humming softly beneath the faint glow of the overhead lights, the kind of artificial warmth that tries to mimic a home but falls just short, the way all things on the road do. Felix had just packed away his guitar after the evening's sound check, the familiar buzz of his fingertips still lingering in the joints of his hands, the ache of chord progressions and riffs weaving through his limbs like a pulse. The rest of the band had shuffled off to the back lounge or slipped out to grab a late meal on whatever patch of city they happened to be in today. But Felix wasn't ready to let the night slip away into the blur of bus stops and motel stairwells quite just yet. He turned a corner and caught sight of Nolan, the drummer still lingering near the back of the bus, the faint yellow light from the small reading lamp above casting half his face in shadow. Nolan's sandy blonde hair was buzz-cut tight tonight, the stubble showing off the sharp bone structure of his jawline, in cruel contrast to how soft his eyes sometimes looked in the bright glare of backstage chaos. Now those piercing blue eyes seemed retreating, far off. Somewhere under a glaze of quiet, the way someone might look when they're far more tangled in thought than present. Nolan's forearms, usually so capable and steady, with drumsticks in hand, were clasped tightly around those familiar sticks, as though holding onto them balanced something he wasn't sure how to release. His tattoo, the faint, barely there line work, telling its own story, caught the light in a subtle flash as he flexed his fingers. It was such a small movement, one Felix probably wouldn't have noticed if he'd been anywhere else. But this familiar space with the man he'd known for nearly 2 years of endless tour days. "I thought everyone already left," Felix said, his voice softer than normal, a little tentative. As if the usual easy banter might bounce off something fragile between them tonight, Nolan shifted but didn't look up right away. "Yeah," he said, voice low, barely above a whisper. His hands tightened around the sticks for a heartbeat longer, and then he exhaled sharply, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of days unsaid. "I needed a minute," he admitted finally, glancing up with that hardness just flickering at the edges, like he wasn't quite sure how to be himself in this small bubble of quiet. We need to talk." Felix blinked, heart odd and sharp in his chest. "We?" A gentle pause settled like dust, swirling in golden light. Nolan's mouth twitched, barely perceptible. "Yeah," he said again, almost reluctant but resolute. "You and me." The bass hum of the engine thrummed beneath them, a constant reminder of the world barreling forward outside the bus walls. But inside, time slackened, folding around what was coming next like smoke curling toward the ceiling. The corners of the beat-up tour bus, usually a chaotic blend of laughter and noise, felt suddenly crowded with a quiet tension neither of them had planned for or expected. Felix knelt down, resting one elbow on the armrest of a worn leather seat, his curls falling just past his ears in lazy rebellion, and searched Nolan's face. The subtle scar above his right eyebrow twitched in the dim light, an old souvenir from a reckless day on the road. But tonight it seemed carved by something far newer, uncertainty. "Okay," Felix said softly. "What's going on?" Nolan's fingers finally loosened their grip, dropping the sticks onto the adjacent table with a soft thump that echoed oddly against the dark. He ran a hand through his hair, the muscles in his neck pulsing where tension had set in. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot. Maybe more than I should have. About who I am. About what I thought I knew." Felix swallowed hard and leaned in, the faint scent of worn leather and something faintly metallic drifting from Nolan, the smell of late-night sweat, and the oscillating pressure of adrenaline still clinging from rehearsals. "You mean about being straight," Felix said carefully. Careful not to push, but unable to keep the question out. Nolan's eyes met his, blue piercing into hazel raw and unguarded. "Yeah," he said simply, almost like that word held more weight than anything else he could say. "I've always told you, and everyone else, I'm straight." I believed it. I was sure of it. But lately things have been different. Felix's chest tightened, but he kept his voice calm, soft, steady. Different how? Nolan hesitated, his lips parted like he was chewing on words too sharp to swallow easily. It's you, he said it in a rush, as though finally saying the two syllables would either free him or shatter something vital. You're the only person who gets the noise in my head, the way my hands move when I'm behind the kit. You make me think about things I never thought I'd have to think about, and that scares the hell out of me. The hum of the bus was a steady river beneath the flood of confession. Felix's breath hitched, because with every word, every tremor in Nolan's voice, he could feel a fragile vulnerability settling across the space between them. Years of late nights and practiced smiles had never prepared him for this raw honesty, the edges of their friendship suddenly blurring. I'm not asking for answers, Nolan hurried to add, eyes flicking away, glancing at the ceiling, at the worn floor, anywhere but at Felix's face. I just needed to say it out loud. Time dilating and contracting with the honesty exposed between them. His fingers flexed, itching to reach out, to do something, anything, to anchor Nolan's storm of uncertainty. Instead, he settled for mere words wrapped in warmth. Thank you for telling me, Felix said, voice gentle but sure. Whatever happens, no matter where your head or heart goes, you don't have to face it alone. There was a long pause, filled only with the quiet chorus of tires humming against asphalt. The distant city lights flickering elusive promises outside the tinted windows. Nolan's blue eyes glistened with a shimmer Felix hadn't seen before, or fragile. He swallowed, and then nodded once, sharply, as if the weight now shared was something they could both bear. You know, I never thought I'd see you like this, Felix admitted. His gaze lingered on Nolan's face, tracing each subtle line, each hesitation. But maybe there's more to you than just the guy who keeps the beat. But maybe there's more to you than just the guy who keeps the beat. Maybe there's more to me than just the guy who plays the guitar. Nolan dared a smile. Then, small and hesitant, but real. I'm glad you think that. Felix reached out then, just a hand brushing against Nolan's forearm. The faint tattoo there a quiet testament to the man beneath the drummer's exterior. The bus groaned softly as it idled outside the venue, the muffled sound like a lullaby for unspoken possibilities. For all their restless miles and the chaos of this never-ending tour, for the blur of cities and crowds and faces, in this moment, this long, lingering conversation under the dim glow of the lights, Felix found something steadier than any chord or rhythm. Something that felt like the first hesitant strum of a new song. Nolan's tight grip on his drumsticks finally relaxed, and the weight of all the years of music and silence and friendship had shifted, opening a space brimming with fragile, raw potential. We need to talk, Nolan had said. But maybe, Felix thought, what they really needed was to listen to each other, to the truth that had been waiting in the wings, waiting for midnight to finally speak. The stage lights bathed the venue in a wash of electric blue, and the thick pulse of the bass vibrated through the floorboards beneath Felix's feet. He gripped his guitar neck with a practiced ease, but his attention was already elsewhere, tangled in the way Nolan's body moved behind the drum kit. The drummer's arms rose and fell with a fierce, unyielding precision. Striking snares and cymbals like the rhythm was an extension of his own heartbeat. A heartbeat Felix was learning to listen to in a different key. It struck him that night how Nolan's usual stoic mask was softened by the primordial pulse of the music, how the tight set of his jaw relaxed when he locked in with the band. His piercing blue eyes, usually sharp and a little guarded, were narrowed in concentration. But behind the intensity was an almost tender vulnerability Felix had never dared to dissect before. The faint tattoo on Nolan's left forearm shimmered under the stage lights, an intimate detail that Felix now saw as a map of stories and scars he'd only begun to understand. For a long moment, their eyes met across the stage. Subtle glance, swift and charged. Neither pulled away immediately. Instead, Nolan's gaze held a steady steadiness that caught Felix off guard, sending warmth tumbling through his chest. In that blink of a second, everything else, the roaring crowd, the heat of the lights, the pounding drumbeat, faded down to a hum. Felix felt himself faltering, a note almost missed, and the unspoken conversation between them thickened the air. That hesitation, the soft crack in their usual rhythm, was a delicate revelation. Neither of them was ready to name aloud yet. It hung there, suspended like the last dangling chord of a song that was still unfinished, waiting to be picked up, shaped, and shared. As the music surged, Felix tried to recapture his focus, to ground himself in the setlist and the rehearsed riffs, but Nolan's presence was a new kind of magnetic force pulling at him. The way Nolan's throat moved with each breath, the way his hands seemed to carve the air with invisible patterns, the subtle clench of his jaw before a crash cymbal, all those micro-moments formed a quiet symphony, more echoing than anything Felix had ever played. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about the space between them, the fragile tension born from unspoken words. The song ended, and the crowd's cheers blared around them like thunder, but Felix barely registered it. Nolan caught his eye again. No words, just a flicker of something unsaid, a soft invitation to step closer. Felix gave a small nod, a silent promise they could circle back after the noise settled. Backstage, the rest of the band had collapsed into their usual post-set chaos, laughs spilling over from the bass amp. The whoosh of water bottles cracked open, the jangling of guitar straps being loosened. Felix felt the familiar buzz and exhaustion mingle under his skin, but it was Nolan's voice that pulled him from the blur. "Hey," Nolan said quietly, stepping around a cluster of tangled cables. The sharp smell of sweat and sweat-damp leather mixed with the percussive scent of lacquered drums. "Want to get some air?" Felix looked toward the exit, surprised by the simplicity of the invitation, and by the earnest flicker in Nolan's eyes. For a moment he hesitated, the words from their conversation, hours before, still rolling around his mind like unfinished verses. Then, with a shy grin, he nodded. Outside, the night was a cool blanket over the humming city, the street lights smeared with a gentle orange glow that softened the edges of everything. Nolan pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and wordlessly offered one to Felix. The gesture was casual, but in that small sharing of fire and smoke, a quiet intimacy passed between them. Felix struck his lighter, the flame flickering in the shadowed alley, and drew a slow breath, the sharp bite of tobacco mingling with the crisp night air. He watched Nolan for a moment, how the smoke curled like a pale halo around his determined face, the way his blue eyes caught the light and seemed to reflect some untold pain. "You okay?" Felix ventured tentatively, breaking the silence that had grown comfortable but heavy. Nolan let out a dry laugh that curiously didn't sound like humor. "Like you don't know," he muttered, flicking ash against the cracked concrete. The weight behind the words was palpable, not a complaint, but a confession. "This shit," gestured vaguely toward the bus, the band, the endless grind, "it wears on you. Even when it looks like you're just playing the same song over and over, on repeat." Felix inhaled again, feeling the cold air dig into his lungs, pulling up his own reserve of buried exhaustion and loneliness. "You don't have to face it alone," he said quietly. "You've got us, and you've got me." Nolan's gaze softened, and for a moment the wall around him, built from years of assumptions, denial, and self-protection, trembled just enough to let a crack of earnestness show through. "Yeah, you really think so?" Felix nodded, stepping a little closer. The warmth from their proximity a balm he hadn't expected to need. "I mean it. I'm here. We're all here. Maybe we don't have to play these parts alone anymore. The vulnerability in Nolan's eyes was startling, a rare treasure hidden beneath his tough exterior. I've been carrying a lot, he admitted, voice low and rough. Stuff I wasn't ready to own. Stuff I thought made me less. He exhaled a long plume of smoke, watching it fade like the weight he'd been holding on to. Being called straight, that label made me feel like I had to stay in a box, even when the edges didn't fit anymore. Felix's heart clenched. He reached out, not quite touching, but close enough to convey solidarity. Labels don't define us, not the band, not the tour, not the people around us. They're just words. Sometimes they're cages, but sometimes we can break out. For the first time that night, Nolan smiled, genuine, unguarded curve that lit up his face against the night. Maybe that's the new song we're supposed to write, Felix grinned back, the sound of their laughter mingling with the distant hum of late-night traffic. The looming uncertainty of what was to come slipped away for a moment, replaced by a fragile hope, like fragile notes rising in a sudden, unexpected melody. They stayed under that dim halo of streetlight, sharing words and silences, smoke and breaths, until the world felt less heavy, the night less lonely. In the quiet intimacy of that alley, Felix realized that what they had, fragile, tentative, but real, was worth the risk of stepping into the unknown. And in Nolan's steady presence, Felix found the courage to believe that maybe, after all these miles and these songs, they could find a new rhythm together, one that wasn't just about who they were supposed to be, but who they dared to become. Felix dragged in a slow breath, the sharp night air catching at the back of his throat. He leaned against the cool brick wall, the fine grit of dust and soot sticking faintly to his skin, but he barely noticed. The city sounds, distant horns, muffled voices, the ever-present hum of restless tires against wet pavement, caressed the silence between them in an almost soothing rhythm. He looked at Nolan, who still stood close, shoulders squared, but no longer rigid, eyes tracing the faint lines where shadow met lamplight. There was a quiet fragility in Nolan's stance tonight, a rawness Felix hadn't seen before. Felix's voice came soft, softer than he'd expected. You know? He paused, trying to find words that weren't heavy with the weight of music or expectation. Words that spoke to something deeper, something neither of them had quite laid bare yet. Sometimes I feel like all anyone ever wants from me is the guitar player. Like I'm an imager, sound, a role, a series of strings and chords, but nobody really sees me, not the real me. He swallowed past the sudden tightening in his chest. And that loneliness? It cuts into you. Lonely in a room full of people. Lonely in a world that's always wanting you to be just one version of yourself over and over. Not the messy, complicated guy underneath. He finally met Nolan's eyes, steady and searching. I'm not just a performer. I'm a man who tries every day to figure out what all this means beyond the stage and the bright lights. Sometimes I just want someone to see me without all the noise. There was a tremor in Felix's voice, subtle, almost buried beneath the quiet city night, but Nolan caught it. That tiny fracture in his words was an invitation, and something in Nolan's usual wall of carefully measured calm began to crumble. His blue eyes, always so guarded, softened, vulnerability threading through the usual intensity. Nolan looked down for a moment, as if afraid that if he met Felix's gaze directly, everything might spill out all at once. I never knew it felt like that for you, Nolan said, voice rough but low. The kind of voice you use when saying something you weren't sure you were ready to say. You make it look easy, the jokes, the riffs. The way you step into that spotlight, like it's just another part of who you are. But I guess you're right. People don't see past the performance. They don't want to see the cracks. His eyes flicked back up, glinting faintly in the streetlight, and the scar above Felix's eyebrow seemed to burn hotter in the intimate glow. Because if they do, maybe they'd have to face their own. Felix nodded slowly, warmth blooming in the cold. There was an unspoken truth in that. Every one of them came on this tour carrying some hidden weight, some part of themselves they left behind on other stages or in other towns. Nolan, who always seemed so solid, so untouchable, was no exception. "I get that," Felix said, voice gentler now taking a step closer. His breath fogged faintly in the chill as he exhaled. "We all have our walls. I've built mine so high it almost became a fortress." He smiled briefly. "A quiet, rueful thing. But standing here with you right now, I don't want that anymore. I want to tear them down, even if it means shaking loose some dust and old ghosts." Nolan's lips twitched, a shadow of a smile. But there was something else there. Something open, fragile, like a door half ajar in a long-abandoned hallway. The bus loomed behind them, a cavernous shell of solitude and transient home. They moved toward it together, the air thick with after-hours city scents, faint diesel, cold metal, a trace of spilled coffee and leather seats. The heavy door sighed as it swung open, and the dim glow of the interior wrapped around them, cocooning Felix in its familiar, quiet embrace. Inside, Nolan settled into the worn leather bench in the back, the one usually reserved for Felix when he wasn't alone. Felix followed, sitting beside him, the narrow space forcing an intimacy that neither had tried to create, but neither wanted to escape. The bus felt different at night, empty except for the two of them, like a breath held in the dark between heartbeats. Outside, the world spun quietly on, unaware of what was unfolding in this tiny, mobile sanctuary. Nolan's hands rested on his knees, still tense, but less guarded. "I've never said these things to anyone," he admitted after a long pause. "Not even to myself, really." His voice cracked at the edges, raw and real in a way that made Felix's heart ache. "I always thought if I admitted there were parts of me I didn't understand, I'd lose control. That I'd disappoint people who expect me to be something I'm not." Felix stayed silent, not out of uncertainty, but reverence. Nolan's admission was a fragile offering, a crack in his armor so stark and unexpected that it didn't need words in response. Sometimes the most powerful kind of connection is held in the quiet between confessions. Nolan glanced over at him, blue eyes reflecting the faint glow of the overhead light, and for the first time, Felix saw the weight Nolan carried, an invisible load made heavier by loneliness and the fear of being truly known. "You make it look easy," Nolan repeated, this time not as an observation but almost a pleading realization. "How do you do it? How do you keep showing up, keep being honest?" Felix exhaled slowly, searching for his own strength in the chilly air. "I don't always," he confessed. "Sometimes I break down when no one's looking. Sometimes I wear a mask for so long I forget what my real face looks like." His smile was small, bittersweet. "But then there are moments like this, the real moments, that remind me I don't have to do it alone. That I can be more than the sum of what people expect." Nolan nodded, the muscles in his jaw working as though processing a newfound truth. "You make me want to try," he said quietly, voice thick, raw now. "Maybe I've been fighting it because it's easier that way. Easy to pretend, easy to hide. But your honesty, it's contagious. You make me want to be braver." Felix reached out again, this time closing the small gap between their hands. His palm was warm, steady, grounding. "Bravery doesn't mean having it all figured out," he said, his words deliberate and gentle. "It means showing up even when you're scared, when you're not sure where it'll lead. And sometimes it means letting someone in, even if just a little." Nolan's fingers traced a tentative line along Felix's palm, a silent promise in a world that rarely gave them guarantees. Maybe, he murmured, voice nearly breaking, this is the start of something real. Even if it's scary as hell. Felix nodded, his heart thudding, a fragile hope blooming like a whispered song, rising from the shadows. The night bus was no stage, the spectators long gone. But here, in the quiet companionship of two men stripped of pretense, music still played, melody composed not of notes, but of truth, trust, and the brave vulnerability of letting a label become irrelevant in the face of something profoundly more human. The hum of the bus engine pulled them gently forward, carrying them through the night on a journey that no setlist could contain. One written in heartbeats and shared silences, in the courage to be seen and the courage to see back. Felix squeezed Nolan's hand, a silent vow, a piece of courage folded carefully between them, ready to be nurtured in the rhythm of whatever was to come. The morning light crept through the cracks in the curtains of the dressing room, pale and unassuming, almost like it was trying too hard not to disturb the fragile tension that had settled overnight, tension perched so tenuously between Felix and Nolan that it felt like a held breath waiting for release or collapse. Felix woke feeling the weight of silence heavier than any typical post-soundcheck fatigue. The mingled scent of old leather, sweat, and lingering coffee hung in the air, reminders of the tour bus and the world they carried with them in this cramped space. He rubbed the back of his neck, the faint pulse of adrenaline lingering like a rhythm beneath his skin, one not quite from the music. Nolan was already up when Felix slipped out. The space by the door where the air felt a little cooler because the window was cracked just an inch. His lean figure was silhouetted against the dim light outside, arms crossed loosely, the faint tattoo on his forearm catching slivers of light. Those piercing blue eyes flicked toward Felix when he entered, but held something unsaid, a guarded tension that Felix had never seen there before. Their last conversation clung between them like a fragile thread, strong enough to hold them both in place, but thin enough that a wrong word might unravel everything. At Soundcheck, every motion between them was etched with an unspoken awareness. Felix adjusted the tuning on his guitar, the strings humming faintly, like they were alive, resonant, and hungry. He caught Nolan's hands, the calloused fingers that kept time, that hit hard and sure when the drummer lifted the stack of cymbals inches away. The touch was deliberate. A fleeting spark pulsed through Felix's bones, something electric and delicate at once. Nolan's eyes met his flickering for the briefest moment. Was it surprise? Or question? Before he looked away, biting his bottom lip as he set down the gear more firmly than before. Felix noticed the slight tension in Nolan's jaw, how his strong hands barely trembled, and wondered if he felt it too, that magnetic pull threading between their fingers and glances, pressurized and fragile all at once. There were no words, though Felix caught himself about to say something, anything, just to break the tight coil of silence pressing down on them both. But the moment passed. During the break, as they hauled amplifiers and cables amidst the groove of the empty studio, the rhythm in their movements seemed charged. Every brush of a shoulder, every accidental collision of fingertips, accompanied by a quick, breathless hesitation. Those brief contacts tasted sweet and raw, like a chord hanging in the air, unresolved but potent. Felix could feel his pulse in places where he never expected, across his scalp, the inside of his wrists, his chest, like the aftershocks following a packed, pounding set. They worked side by side, synchronizing the cadence of their steps without speaking. The air between them was different, heavier yet somehow lighter, because it was new, something uncharted, stretching out in front of them, daring them to engage or retreat. Felix found himself watching Nolan's hands more than necessary. The way the faint tattoo traced the sinews of his forearm when he grabbed a cable, the slight shake of his shoulders under the thin fabric of his shirt as he bent to lift a speaker cabinet. There was a tension in Nolan, not a usual kind born of exhaustion or routine, but something deeper, as if he was constantly recalibrating, balancing between the world he'd known and the one being quietly rewritten between them. At one point, Felix reached out to steady Nolan when his footing slipped just a fraction on the uneven floor, and their fingers brushed, electric and abrupt. Neither pulled away immediately. Nolan's hand held firm an extra moment, thumb brushing delicately against the back of Felix's hand, as if testing the waters of affirmation in this newly liminal space. Felix's breath caught his throat dry, but he stayed still, welcoming whatever fragile boldness that small contact signified. The two of them exchanged no words in those hours, yet the silence was no longer empty. It was swollen with possibilities and trepidations. Felix wondered if Nolan was aware how every fleeting touch, every lingering glance, had rewritten the quiet map of boundaries they'd assumed were fixed forever. The word straight, the label Joker had thrown casually the night before, felt both limiting and irrelevant now, like an old chord being retuned into something richer, thicker with overtones. Later, as the last cable was packed away and the studio emptied of its usual noise and chaos, Nolan finally broke the silence, almost abruptly, awkwardly bending low to pick up a tambourine that had fallen behind a stack of amps. "Felix," he said quietly, not looking up. His voice was low, reluctant. Felix's whole body tensed, anticipation coiling in his gut. "Yeah!" Nolan swallowed hard. "Thanks for last night, for staying." He shook his head. "I don't know what I'm saying." Felix smiled softly, the weight in his chest easing just a bit. "You don't have to say anything today. It's enough that you're here." Nolan's eyes finally met his, a flicker of something unguarded and raw within them, like a doorway half opened, waiting to be explored. "Right." And with that, Nolan gave a stiff nod, turning away as if to shove the moment back into its carefully constructed silence. But the tension hadn't fully eased. It had simply stretched taut, delicate in the shared space between their unsaid truths. The afternoon crept in with a languid warmth, sunlight curling lazily through the window of the studio's back, room empty except for an old couch and a scattering of guitar cases and music stands. The air smelt faintly of varnish and worn wood, mixed with the low hum of the air conditioner. Felix sat on the edge of the couch, tuning his guitar with slow, deliberate fingers, the strings resonating softly with each turn of the pegs. The quiet was almost sacred. A note slipped out from his picking fingers, wandering free in the stillness like a quiet call, solitary and hopeful. His gaze lifted to find Nolan lingering near the doorway, watching him with a cautious curiosity that struck Felix deep in the chest. "Gonna play something?" Nolan's voice was low and rough, breaking the hush, but not intruding. Felix smiled gently, shrinking into the weight of the moment. "You can join if you want," he said softly, motioning to the beat-up cajon tucked into the corner. "I'm just noodling, really. Nothing serious." Nolan shifted, stepping into the room fully now, drumsticks resting hesitantly in his hands. The familiar weight of them brought back memories of late-night practices, of hours spent syncing their rhythms with wordless communication. Felix raised an eyebrow, feeling the old gleam of musical camaraderie spark between them. The first few beats were tentative, like a conversation starting with polite phrases. Felix's guitar strummed a steady tempo, light and exploratory, his hazel eyes fixed on Nolan's measured taps. Nolan's stick struck the cajon with a nervous rhythm at first, cautious, almost hesitant, but as the minutes stretched out, the uncertainty in his movement smoothed into something more confident, more assured. Their sounds, guitar and drum, began to weave together, a delicate thread pulled tight with intention and emotion. Felix closed his eyes briefly, letting the music carry him. The melody morphed, growing richer with every strum embracing vulnerability and strength in equal measure. Nolan's beats grew bolder, more insistent, dancing in sync with Felix's picking. The space around them seemed to shimmer with the music's pulsar, living thing, sustained by the quiet trust blooming between them. Felix thought about all the times they'd shared charts and set lists, arrangements and jams. But this was different. This was unfiltered. Music holding space for the muddled, the raw, the tremulous. As Nolan's blue eyes caught his again, glinting with a mixture of nervousness and something fiercer beneath, Felix felt a warmth blossoming inside, a tether reaching out across every note and every breath. "Nolan," Felix murmured between strums, voice soft almost as a secret, this feels right." "With you?" Nolan's grip on the sticks faltered for a split second before he laughed, a low, uneven sound that cracked through the tension like a sudden burst of sunlight. "Right?" he said, voice brittle but honest. "Feels like. Maybe there's a rhythm to this that I didn't expect." Felix opened his eyes and reached out, fingers barely brushing Nolan's wrist, where the warm skin met the tattooed forearm. "You don't have to figure it all out now. Just feel it, play it, let it come." Nolan nodded, exhaling slowly, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing. His taps grew softer, coaxing a slower, gentler melody from the cajon. Felix responded with a mellow chord progression, notes ringing out clean and true, delicate but unyielding. Music and moment folded into one another. Spacious, safe, imbued with fragile hope. For a long time they played like that, two people speaking in rhythms and tones rather than words, their instruments telling stories their lips couldn't dare to whisper yet. Outside the shelter of the studio, the world pressed on relentlessly, but inside, the outside noise dimmed to nothing. There was only the music, only the shared breath of two hearts finding a new tempo, a new harmony. When the last note finally drifted into silence and the room seemed to hold its breath, Felix glanced over to see Nolan's eyes glistening faintly, a quiet vulnerability there that stripped away all frontiers. Nolan swallowed, voice low and trembling just slightly. "Thanks for letting me in." Felix smiled, heart swelling with a fragile, fierce kind of joy. "You're already in. No turning back now." Nolan's laugh was softer this time, more genuine, as if the music had unlocked something inside him, a door to honesty and unspoken dreams. "Good," he said, "because this feels more like us than anything I've known before." Felix leaned back, strumming a few languid chords, letting the afterglow settle like a balm. One beat at a time. The studio lights dimmed, and for the first time since the beginning of the tour, the silence between them wasn't heavy or fraught, it was a promise. A melody still unfolding, waiting to be played, fragile and thrilling. The studio was nearly deserted when Nolan finally started gathering his things. The last fading hum of the amps and the faint scent of sweat and leather lingered in the air, a testament to the hours they'd spent weaving through rhythms and silences, building something both fragile and fierce. Felix watched him quietly, heart still pounding with the thin pulse of courage the night had coaxed out of him. Nolan's eyes flicked up briefly, meeting his, then darted away, like a bird, unsure if it wanted to fly or stay perched in familiar safety. "Nolan," Felix's voice broke the stillness, soft but steady. "Before you go, what is it really? I mean, what do you want? From this, from me, from anything?" The words came out with unexpected urgency, the vulnerability in his chest pouring into his tone. It was tougher saying it aloud than he'd imagined. Nolan hesitated. His fingers trembled just a little as he folded his jacket over his arm. His blue eyes, usually so sharp and guarded, shimmered with a rare uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, low and raw. "I mean, God, Felix, This whole thing, what we just did, it's uncharted territory for me. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to run or stay, let alone how to even feel. That flicker of doubt and longing clashed in his gaze like a storm caught between wanting and fearing. I followed orders, kept my head down, played the straight line because that's what made sense. It wasn't supposed to be complicated, but now... He let the thought hang, voice trailing off into the quiet. Felix stepped forward instinctively, emboldened by the open fracture, in Nolan's usual composure. It's okay to not have the answers yet. None of this essay has to be anything more than what feels right now. His fingers brushed over Nolan's forearm lightly, tentative bridge between their hesitations. You don't have to have it all figured out, because I don't either. Nolan's jaw tensed, lips parting as if to speak, and then closing again. For a moment, raw emotion flickered behind those guarded eyes, the kind of vulnerability you only see when someone lets their armor slip just a crack. It's easier to say when I'm not thinking so much about what other people expect, Nolan murmured finally, almost to himself. But here, with you, no scripts, no rehearsals. Just us. That scares the hell out of me. But it feels real. Felix's chest tightened with empathy and something deeper. Scared because it's new, or scared because it might change everything? A ghost of a smile passed over Nolan's face, a tremulous acknowledgement. Maybe both. His gaze settled back onto Felix. Steady this time. And maybe, because I'm starting to want something more than just the music we make together. And that terrifies me completely. There was an electric weight to the moment, the quiet space between them, charged with fear and hope, braided together. Felix didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached up and tugged the collar of Nolan's jacket gently, anchoring his words with a quiet certainty. Then, let's learn it together. No rush, no rules. Just whatever this is, our tempo. Nolan's breath hitched, eyes glimmering with a mixture of relief and something thrillingly tender as he nodded slowly. Okay, he said softly. Okay. Asterisk. The tour bus rumbled steadily along the highway, wrapped in the pale blue hush of early dawn. City lights flickered faintly behind them, swallowed gradually by the slow, encroaching promise of day. Felix sat pressed against the window, the glass cool against his skin, eyes tracing the blur of passing scenery that felt more like a dream than reality. Nolan was beside him, close, but not really close. Their usual casual proximity, now curiously loaded with a quiet tension that neither dared break. The silence stretched out between them like an unspoken question, heavy with everything unsaid. Felix felt the pulse of the road thrumming beneath the tires, mirroring the erratic beats inside his chest. The words that had swirled so freely in the dim light of the studio now tangled and caught in his throat, stuck behind a barricade of uncertainty and fear. Finally, when the sky lightened to a soft wash of pink and gold, Felix squeezed his eyes shut for a long moment, drew a ragged breath, and turned to Nolan. His voice was low, threading through the stillness cautiously. I have to tell you something. Something I haven't said because I didn't want to break the spell or scare you away. Nolan's head tilted slightly, watching him with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold the ocean of his emotions just beneath the surface. What is it? He asked quietly, voice rough like gravel in the quiet morning. Felix swallowed hard the words, raw and stubborn, pressing to be freed. I've fallen for you, he said it plainly, like stating a fact that was both terrifying and undeniable. I didn't plan it. Didn't even realize it was happening until I was halfway through the night watching you almost break apart in that silence after all the music. But it's true, I'm falling for you, Nolan. The confession hung between them, raw and trembling. Felix's fingers curled unconsciously into the fabric of his jacket, mind spinning with questions of whether he had just shattered everything or finally stitched a chance at something real. Nolan's expression didn't shift for a long moment. He didn't pull away, didn't reply, but he also didn't deny it. His gaze remained steady, almost reverent, as if Felix's words had opened a quiet sanctuary where truth could settle softly without judgment. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was laden with possibility, fragile as the dawn light spilling over the horizon outside. After what felt like an eternity, Nolan's voice came, rough and thoughtful. Not quite an answer, but not a retreat either. "I'm not sure how I got here. But hearing you say that, it means more than I can say." His eyes caught Felix's, searching and vulnerable. "Maybe I'm scared, but maybe I'm also ready to see where this goes." Felix's heart lifted at that uncertainty, because within it was hope, a trembling openness to whatever the future held. He reached out, fingers brushing against Nolan's hand like a secret promise. The road stretched ahead, long and unknown, but for the first time in a long time, Felix felt like he wasn't alone. The rising sun spilled golden light over their quiet space, bathing them both in warmth and the unspoken promise of new beginnings. And in that fleeting dawn, beneath the steady hum of the bus engine and the encroaching day, the possibility of us felt both terrifying and beautiful. Their melody still unfolding, waiting for the next note. The night felt thicker than the usual hum of the tour bus, like the air had pulled tight around them, charged and waiting for a spark. Felix was just on the cusp of slipping into deep sleep when something pressed lightly against his arm, a cautious weight that didn't quite belong to dreams. His eyes blinked open, groggy and reluctant, to find Nolan sitting on the edge of his bed, his face half hidden in the dim glow of the small reading lamp by the window. Felix's pulse had already begun to quicken. The silence stretched between them, dense and almost fragile, like a thread dangling, easy to snap yet impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry," Nolan said, voice low and raw, the kind of quiet that jolted more than a shout. "I didn't mean to wake you." Felix sat up a little straighter, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "It's okay," he murmured, voice thick with surprise and something heavier anticipation maybe. "What's up?" Nolan's fingers curled into the fabric of his jeans, a small gesture of nervousness that made Felix's chest tighten. I've been thinking about us." About last night. His words were clicked at first, as if finding the right ones was a battle with himself. "And I'm scared. I don't really know what this means. I don't want to mess up what we already have, or make it weird." Felix swallowed hard. The vulnerability behind Nolan's words cutting through any lingering fatigue. "We're both scared," he said softly. "But I think that's part of it, part of moving forward." Nolan's eyes were dark, watching Felix like he was weighing the truth behind the words. "I don't even know what I'm feeling exactly. I thought I was straight my whole life. Everything just lined up that way, you know? But now, it's like there's this part of me I didn't dare listen to before." He exhaled slowly, a sound that felt like surrender and courage tangled together. "I want to try, to see where it goes, even if it's messy or confusing. Even if it scares the hell out of me." Felix's heart flared with an emotion so fierce and tender, it nearly brought tears to his eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted, from you, from us, to try. To be honest, no matter what." Nolan shifted closer, hand reaching out trembling, brushing against Felix's in a hesitant, almost reverent touch. "It's been years of silence, of pretending. I feel like I'm finally breathing in a way I haven't before." A shaky smile broke through Felix's fatigue. "You're not alone anymore. Not in this." They sat there, the murmur of the bus fading into the background like a distant ocean. Words stopped mattering. Instead, there was the electric weight of touch, the quiet honesty of presence, the beginning of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The days that followed carried a quiet intensity that both exhilarated and grounded them. Outside, the relentless chaos of touring, the noise, the flashing lights, the blur of faces and places, covered them like the roar of a storm. Inside, Felix and Nolan found their own refuge in whispers and stolen moments, carving out a private world behind closed doors and under the vast sky of unspoken rules and expectations. Opening up publicly still felt impossible. There was a fragile kind of fear wrapped in every glance they exchanged during sound checks or between sets, a tension born from what could be, but wasn't yet allowed to be. The bandmates' friendly chatter fell like an echo against the walls that kept their truth tucked away, unspoken but pulsing beneath the surface. Felix caught himself watching Nolan more often now, tracing the line of his jaw in his mind, memorizing the way his eyes narrowed when he was focused, or how his lips twisted into a half-grin when no one else was looking. These small details carved out new places in his heart, places he hadn't known were empty before. Nolan, in turn, grew quieter in public, a slow retreat from the rougher edges of his usual bravado. He kept a tighter rein on his usual teasing, like he was guarding something precious, and every time their hands met, brief, careful, maybe just a finger, sliding lightly against a palm, Felix felt fire bloom in his veins. They had become masters of the careful touch and the whispered word. Night, when the bus finally slowed and the world fell away, Felix found Nolan pressed against the small counter of their cramped kitchen, hair mussed from a long day, shoulders tense with exhaustion, but eyes softening when Felix approached. "Nolan," Felix said one night, voice a quiet anchor in the white noise of the engine. "I don't want this to feel like hiding anymore." Nolan's gaze lifted, vulnerable and fierce all at once. "I know. Me neither." "But fuck, Felix, it's not just that I'm scared for me. It's the fear of what everyone else will think, what they'll say." "I'm not just risking myself here," Felix nodded slowly, understanding the invisible weight Nolan carried. "I'm scared too. But if this is real, and it feels real, I want to fight for it. Even if that means fighting for ourselves first." Their conversations belonged to the sacred twilight hours, when the outside world couldn't hear them, couldn't see the fragile hardness in their voices break down into something tender, raw. Sometimes Nolan's voice cracked, and Felix's hands would move instinctively to steady him, fingers threading through hair or brushing along a cheek, grounding them both. One night, leaning into each other quietly by the window, the city light smearing gold and blue against the glass, Nolan whispered, "I never thought I'd have this kind of secret with someone. It's terrifying. But it's also the only thing that feels like home." Felix's breath hitched, a faint smile pulling at his lips. "Then let's keep it safe. This secret. Between us, no matter how messy or imperfect it is." The secret became their lifeline, a whispered promise woven into the spaces between songs and the hum of travel. It was fragile, yes, fiercely real, a tether holding them steady as everything around them spun. In the roar of the crowd, the flash of stage lights, the endless swirl of the tour, they carved out moments of quiet, fingers linked under the table, shared glances across crowded rooms, the brush of a thumb against knuckles, and the fleeting warmth of pressed foreheads in the darkness of their room. Every touch was an unspoken vow, every whispered word a thread pulling them closer. The world beyond the bus could wait. For now, their secret was enough. It was theirs alone, something sacred born from the fear and hope that had finally collided, reshaping everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and what it really meant to be seen. Night after night, Felix tried to memorize the curve of Nolan's smile when he thought no one was looking. The small, shy gratitude, etched in those moments, and Nolan held tight to the rare softness Felix offered, a quiet rebellion against the hard lines of their days. Together they navigated the uncertain space between friendship and something deeper, something more. Each whispered confession and careful touch was a step forward, fragile but fearless, toward a future they didn't yet fully understand but wanted to discover, side by side, no matter how long it took. The air backstage was thick with the low hum of anticipation, the scent of sweat and stale air mixing with the faint trace of freshly polished drumsticks. Instruments lay scattered across the floor, cables coiling like half-forgotten snakes, waiting to spring to life. Felix was tuning his guitar when a movement caught his eye, a clumsy reach, a collision that wasn't quite accidental. Nolan had been adjusting a cymbal stand, his large hands sure, but the moment distracted. His fingers brushed against Felix's hand as he passed, the contact fleeting but electric. Neither pulled away. Felix felt the thrum spread like a quiet shockwave deep in his chest. Without breaking the silence, he squeezed Nolan's hand, gently, soft, deliberate. It was small, almost insignificant to anyone else. But to him, it felt seismic. A subtle affirmation, a tether in the chaos of sound and noise and too many people. Nolan's blue eyes flicked toward Felix, a glimmer of something unspoken, swirling there before he blinked it away and returned to his setup. Felix's breath hitched, the space between the two suddenly charged, a silent language only they could understand. The cursory touch of skin against skin light, as the flutter of a moth's wing, had settled heavy and real inside him. It was as though, in that brief graze, the world paused and a new rhythm took hold, one neither could ignore. The moment stretched just long enough for Felix to memorize the way Nolan's jaw tightened reflexively, the faintest curve of his lips, hesitant but unmistakably there, an invitation. A question, the first note of a song they hadn't dared to play before. It was fragile but unbreakable. Later that afternoon, a rare day off glowed bright and steady under an autumn sun, the kind of light that softened edges and blurred lines. The city park was a burst of calm after the storm of the stage, a sanctuary woven with pathways lined by golden leaves and tall trees arching like sentinels that had witnessed lovers and strangers alike. They wandered slowly, side by side, letting the quietness settle around them, the usual noise of the tour, the crowds, the voices, the rush-felt light, years away here. Felix found himself noticing the way the sun caught in Nolan's buzzed blonde hair, turned it almost silver, and the way the pale tattoo on his forearm seemed to pulse with life as he moved. They talked about everything that wasn't music for once, about childhood summers spent chasing fireflies, Nolan's grandfather's fishing tales that were mostly exaggerations, but mesmerizing all the same. Felix shared memories of old friends lost in small towns, nights when he'd sneak out just to watch the stars without any audience. The conversation drifted, weaving a tapestry of stories and laughter. And then, quietly, the spaces between words began to stretch, filling with something unnameable. Nolan's voice lowered, softer than before. "You know, I always figured I had to stick to what I knew, what I